Today we are discussing the 4th season and final episode and series finale of Netflix The Umbrella Academy. I was a big fan of season 1 and 2, but not so much of season 3. Did I love, like, or hate how things ended? Well, we'll be discussing everything in today's breakdown, but first, let's hear your thoughts about how this season ended in the comments below. Did you all enjoy or not enjoy this season finale? What did you all think about the season overall? What worked, what didn't work? Who was your favorite character, your favorite episode? And also, how would you rank all 4 seasons from worst to best? And lastly, what will you remember most about this series overall? Now, since this was the finale and was the longest episode of the season, I'll be discussing the final episode about how I felt about how things transpired and how we got to this point and how it all ended, and then we'll go into my overall thoughts of the season as a whole. With all that being said, it's time to stop the apocalypse from happening one last time. Spoilers ahead. We open this 6th and final episode, which was titled In the Beginning, with seeing Jean with a J and Abigail, who's using Jean with a G skin, as they're giving orders to release the song Map of Problem Mystique by Muse to all the undercover Umbrella agents across the city. Now, it's interesting that they chose that particular song to play because according to some who believe the meaning behind the song is in reference to the research results of Limits of Growth, which was a study talking about the potential effects of limited resources which would be the cause of extinction. As Jean with a J gives them a speech about reclaiming their rightful timeline and they won't stand for those stopping the cleanse from happening. I'll be discussing this more in depth a little bit later in this breakdown, but I thought that Jean with a J and Jean with a G had some potentials to be some really cool and interesting villains, but unfortunately, they fell victim of the limited episodes this season and ultimately felt like a wasted potential set of new characters. As Reggie and Victor arrive, and after their bond from almost dying in the previous episode, we see Reggie listens to Victor's advice on how they should approach Jennifer and Ben, as Victor suggests that he try to talk to them and negotiate with them before they become the cleanse. Now, after listening to the awkward conversation that Jean with the G was having with Reggie and Victor, we see Jean with the J is continuing to realize that Jean isn't acting himself. After getting into an argument in front of their followers of the Keepers, we see Abigail Jean decides to kill Jean with a J. Now, this death in this moment to me could have had more impact and importance to the overall story, but unfortunately we didn't spend any time with them and their relationship. Hell, we never really got a good explanation of how they started the Keepers and how they managed to convince all their members to see these artifacts as a ways of being from the wrong timeline, and how their memories and other timelines started to come back. It just to me felt like it was rushed and just matter of fact type of explanation, and their motives were just handled this season in such a poor manner. Now, Reggie ultimately agrees to give Victor time to reach out to Ben. As we watch, Victor convinces the Keepers that he's one of them, and he manages to get past them through the alley where he sees an opening into the building, but not before killing one of the Keepers who tries to stop him. Now inside, we find Jennifer and Ben's bodies have transformed or mutated into the cleanse as it's getting closer to beginning. Now back with Diego and Luther, we see Diego has turned over a new leaf and he's starting to realize how fortunate he is to have Lila in his own family. He also points out how Luther's got to win by being able to discover the conspiracy within the CIA of being a part of the Keepers, as this was something that Five wasn't even able to uncover. Which, speaking of Five, we see him and Lila finally get back from their subway time traveling adventures to a happy Diego who's missed his wife, which comes as a surprise to her. As Lila heads inside to her kids who are happy to see her as well, we see Klaus, Allison, and Claire arrive to this unplanned family gathering. I have so many issues that I'll be discussing more, but the relationship between Lila and Five this season was extremely out of left field and so unnecessary and such a ridiculous subplot. As Five gets upset after looking at Diego kissing and hugging his wife who's returned, and we see Five is now in his feelings and he begins to speak his mind as him and Diego get into each other's faces. Now Lila has to break them up as Diego notices the bracelet that Five made for her when they were lost, as Diego puts 2 and 2 together and asks if there's something going on between them after remembering finding her at the coffee shop back in episode 1 and getting suspicious about her having an affair. She explains to him about what happened and how they got lost over the past 7 years in this time station, as after countless attacks and being chased down, which by the way, we were never shown any of those actions, it was just applied through the dialogue, and we got that montage back in episode 5. Now she never technically answers Diego's most question as this Jerry Springer moment is cut short as they see what's happening with Ben on television. Now, like the cleanse, let's connect the two main plots of this finale. Now, inside the store, we see Victor tries explaining what the cleanse is to Ben. Now, the real Ben from within this trance has the moment and claims that he's afraid and he wants to go home, but is ultimately overtaken by the bond in the cleanse as he ultimately knocks out Victor. Now, despite all the family drama going on, we see the crew finally arrives as their plan to secretly sneak past the keepers fail as they begin to shoot at them. We watch as Lila has to talk some confidence into Five to get him to blink into the store with Jennifer and Ben, which he manages to do. Now, I don't know if it was truly explained why Five's powers were so unstable this season after getting them back in episode 2, but to that point, it was never really explained why when all of them got their powers back, they were either altered or someone like Allison, for example, her powers just seemed altered altogether. Was that really explained or explored in this season? Let me know in the comments below. We watch as Victor tries to remove the Durango from Ben, and while touching him, he gets a glimpse into this unknown location, which is revealed later in this episode. Now, unfortunately, the time has run out for Victor as we see Reggie orders a shot to be taken on Ben. For one last moment, we see the real Ben steps in again and pushes and saves Victor by getting hit and instead takes the shot in the chest, killing him, which leads to Jennifer to merging their bodies together into this cleansed creature monster. Now, quick side note, I truly don't know what's become of this show that I used to love in so many ways, but despite some questionable narrative decisions and character decisions, the action to me has always been entertaining, has been very creative, and very visually pleasing to watch. But with that said, we watch as I think this is one of the worst CGI action sequences that's taken place in this entire series, in my humble opinion. Whether it was watching Luther slapping his own ass in the middle of this fight, to Klaus randomly learning how to fly, which by the way that they handled Klaus this season was an absolute joke, to seeing Lila uncontrollable laser beams, to seeing the cleanse monster growing in size, and Diego and Five fighting in the middle of all of this. This to me was a complete disaster of a scene that looked terrible. But more importantly, the plot has been lost from the start of this season, and the level of stakes in this scene and the impact was completely absent for me. But as I digress, watch as Allison tries to use her new starlight powers from the boys, but can't do it because she sees the face of Ben, which leads to her ultimately getting knocked out. Goofy Luther's hand gets stuck in the ass of the monster as Victor and Lila try to use their powers together, but it makes the monster grow even bigger. Now, mind you, Five and Diego are still fighting about the affair in the midst of the end of the world going on until we see Lila breaks them up again and tells Five that it's over as we watch him blink away back into the subway. Back outside, we see Abigail finally reveals herself to Reggie as we watch her explain why she did all of this. So ultimately, she feels that ending this world in this timeline and setting things straight by being responsible for creating the cleanse, but also her death being reversed by Reggie. Speaking of Reggie, as he understands why she did all this, they ultimately decide to just let things be as they're ultimately taken out by the monster. Before moving on, I think it's important to note that Abigail was the one who started this from the very beginning of the season, who was the one that hired the band to get back together to look for Jennifer and ultimately getting their plans to end the world in motion. Now, from a character standpoint, that's an interesting idea of them trying to end the world to right their wrongs, but we didn't spend much of any time with Abigail at all this entire series. But the thing that kind of took me out of this scene was just thinking about Reggie. Now, we've been led to believe that he is this intelligent alien being, but not once did he notice her leaving the house and setting up all this plans in motion this entire time. That to me was kind of ridiculous. Now, I do have a question for you all. Was she doing this for the past 5 years and getting this whole Keepers in motion? Or was this her plan at the end of season 3? Or did she create this after discovering how large the Keepers became and learning about Jennifer and the accident? Let me know when you all believe that Abigail's plans start to set into motion in this particular season. Meanwhile, Five is back on the train as he's thinking about all the time he spent with Lila over the past 7 years with their time together falling in love. As the train comes to a stop, as he sees himself and follows where he finds a diner filled with alternate timeline versions of himself inside. Most of them have given up on fixing the problem, which we learn and discover that it is broken timelines. Now we find out that the timelines were broken by the Umbrella Academy over 145,000 times. Now he also learns that the reason Five created the commission was to fix this very issue. Now shout out to my MCU fans out there, but this particular subplot with him creating the commission to fix these timelines reminded me so much of Loki season 1 and He Who Remains creating the TVA to stop himself from destroying the multiverse. As we see see Five must convince his family that they are the ultimate problem and he must convince them to fix this. Back at the Umbrella Mansion, they try to come up with a plan to stop this monster as we see Five is back and tells them the truth. As Five tells them that their birth had major side effects, which was breaking the timeline into multiple numbers of alternate timelines. Now the timelines created over time started to bleed into each other, which explains the artifacts the Keepers were finding and most likely explains why they were getting their old timeline's memories back. As the plan is to get back to the original timeline, we see Victor realizes what Ben was trying to show them, which was the original timeline, and they start to realize that the cleanse isn't all that bad. If they allow themselves to merge with the cleanse, things will be set back, but in doing so, they'll no longer exist in any timeline and there will be no history of the Umbrella Academy at all. They're under the belief that doing this will only erase themselves, but won't erase their families they created, as we see Allison and Klaus say their goodbyes to Claire. Now, as they're saying their goodbyes, we see Lila isn't convinced that their families are going to be safe as she blinks to the subway with the rest of her family and Claire. As Five arrives, and she doesn't listen and she boards the train with everyone else, but ultimately decides to step off to make that tough decision. This moment would have been an emotional goodbye and had some emotional weight, but like many of the story and the subplots, Lila spent most of the season not wanting to be a mother or being with her family, and after getting found out about the affair and all of a sudden caring of what happens to them just wasn't a moment that felt earned to me. He barely spent any time with her and her family that her and Diego created, and her having her parents back who was killed by the handler barely had any screen time as well, which again made me not care about this moment. Now with this one big dysfunctional family finally together as they watch as the world comes to an end, as they say their goodbyes to one another, as we see the monster approaches and ultimately consumes them as the timelines begin to destroy themselves, leaving only one timeline left. As it is now August 8th, 2024, which is funny because that's the actual date in which this final season will be dropping, we find Claire with Lila's family as well as the triplets from season 2. We also see Hazel and his love of his life, Agnes. We see Grace and the handler and many other supporting characters that we've seen in the past who seem to be happy in this main timeline as it's just a normal day. Now, I do have a question before getting into my final thoughts about this finale and the season overall. How does Claire and Lila's and Diego's kids cease to exist? If Allison and Lila and Diego were never born or created, how are they alive? And how are they the same ages before the end of the world and end of their timeline happened? Of course, they have no memory of what happened, but maybe through them going on the train, I guess you can say that they were always meant to be created in the rightful timeline, even though their mothers and their fathers weren't present in that actual timeline. And again, maybe with them being on the train, they would still be born regardless of their parents being alive or not. Again, let me know how Claire and Lila's and Diego's family, not their parents, because obviously they didn't need their parents to be born, but how were their kids able to be alive in this timeline? Now, we end this final episode with what I consider to be maybe the best moment of this finale and arguably maybe the best moment of this entire season. We see the behind the scenes of the various actors and the creators behind the show shooting the series over the years, and even with my issues that I'm going to be sharing here in a second, I will miss this show and this world-ending dysfunctional family. As we get this post-credit scene showing flowers growing under the tree, and it's 8 of these flowers, which to me most likely symbolizes the Umbrella Academy being reborn in a sense. But ultimately, what a disappointing ending. So there you have it, the definitive ending of what was at one point one of my favorite shows, just not on Netflix, but of television period, with seasons 1 and 2, which was so well written, so many great moments, such great entertainment. And after season 3, and honestly after this season, man, have the mighty have fallen. And to me, this might be the worst, or at least tied with the worst season of this entire series. Now, before getting into all my negatives, I will point out some of the moments that I personally enjoyed throughout this 4th and final season. I'll admit I enjoyed episode 2, which I think was the best episode of this final season, as we got to see the whole crew together on this road trip, which was shortly lived. But as they were looking for Jennifer on this road trip and they come across that town of the Keepers, I thought episode 2 had the great sense of humor that I love about this show that really worked. I found the back and forth banter between the family and this dysfunctional family really worked on this road trip. The action of them discovering their new powers was interesting and fun, and it ended with Gene and Jean taking Jennifer and built this this feeling of intrigue and excitement moving forward. Honestly, there were some moments in episode 3 that I enjoyed as we saw them finally learn the truth about the Jennifer accident and getting into the information of what the actual cleanse was and finding out that the memories are coming back and how they were altered by Reggie, and we ultimately do see what happened to Ben, that Reggie was the one that actually killed Jennifer and Ben. Things like that really made for an entertaining plot. But unfortunately, that's where all my pros come to an end. Now, even with my issues that I had with season 3, and man, did I have a lot of the issues with that season and the ridiculous Sparrow storyline, the messy ending, that aside, it was the likability of the characters, and even with the dysfunctional behavior, I always found myself rooting for this family. But when it comes to this season, I can't think of one main character or supporting character that I rooted for or actually liked or actually cared for. In no particular order, let's break down the characters and things I didn't like about the characters in this fourth and final season. I personally didn't care for any of the new characters such as Gene with a J and Gene with a G, who, by the way, I'm big fans of these actors, but the lack of the backstory and the overall silliness of the characters never once took them seriously, and I never fully bought into what they were going for in this season. I also got to throw Jennifer in the mix because she was a new character to this season, and I honestly thought that Jennifer was used as a MacGuffin. They had no character development, no character progression whatsoever, and I did not enjoy the chemistry at all that she had with Ben, who we'll be talking about a little bit later. Now, speaking of couples, talking about Reggie and Abigail, I thought their storyline was extremely underwhelming. Now, putting the spotlight on our main characters in the Umbrella Academy family, who I felt like these characters all went backwards this season and didn't have any growth whatsoever. Number one, I hated how this particular season started off 5 years later from the next season, which to me was just missed out opportunity to show some development and growth from the characters. Let's start off by talking about this dysfunctional couple, Delilah and Diego, who I like individually, but when it comes to them as a couple this particular season, I thought it was so underwritten with them being this kind of Mr. and Mrs. Smith prototypes and them wanting more out of their lives besides being parents, which I get and understand what they were going for, but again, them as parents was just handled so lazy this season. To me, there was just such a huge missed opportunity to explore the depth of them becoming parents, because we know they were raised by characters like Reggie and the Handler, and you would think that creating their own family in their own way would be the most important thing to them because of how they were raised, but no, that was not the case at all, and I just hated every single thing about the relationship up until the very end. Now, switching gears and talking about two of my favorite characters of this entire series, and that's Five and Klaus. To me, they were reduced to shells of themselves or just repeating old character flaws. I've always been a fan of Five and their powers and their wittiness and how they were just the oldest of the family, how much he just hated what they were doing. Always came back to fix things and always cared about his family, but when it came to Five this particular season, he didn't have much to do besides kissing and having an affair with Lila, which, by the way, I legit hated the way that they went with that story. It was so unnecessary, and honestly, it just felt weird and awkward. Switching gears and talking about Klaus, who, like Five, is one of my favorite characters this entire season, but like Five, they literally had nothing to do this season. We watched Klaus become a germaphobe at the beginning of the season, which didn't become anything, to them almost dying, but then being brought back to life, to see them becoming this medium prostitute, to being buried in an entire episode, and just being used for like levity and jokes that I did not find funny at all. I can't tell you how much I hated the treatment of both characters, who I love so much. They were the best thing about the show, even when the show was at its peak in seasons 1 and 2, but I just could not stand what they did to them in this final season. Now, talking about Allison and Luther, who were in the same boat to me as far as characters who didn't have nothing to do. I'll admit, I never really liked their relationship. I always found it weird that they liked each other, and I was so happy when the show wrote in characters like Ray and Sloan, who, by the way, this particular season just threw away the Ray plot and said, oh, they got a divorce and we never saw him. And also Sloan, it was like a mystery that she may have been alive when they got on the elevator in season 3 in the finale, but I guess they just threw that plot away. But going back to Allison and Luther, what exactly was Allison's journey in this season? Her and Reginald had made that agreement at the end of season 3, and we really didn't see much of a change from her because they were supposed to get what they want. She became a commercial actor who all of 2 seconds thought that she was hated from the family of trusting their dad in the finale of season 3, but that went absolutely nowhere. And speaking of nowhere, Luther has always been one of my least favorite characters of the show from the beginning, but he did eventually grow on me at the end of season 1, especially in season 2, and I've always looked at him as, going back to my Marvel comparison earlier, he's like the Drax of the Guardians of the Galaxy. Like, he's the big muscle of the group, but he's also the one you can't take seriously. And speaking of not taken seriously, He was an absolute joke this season. Like, no serious subplots, nothing serious about him at all, just an absolute joke, and he was handled maybe one of the worst characters in this particular final season. And lastly, speaking on Victor and Ben, which, by the way, speaking of Ben, if we remember in season 3, in the post-credit scene, he was on a train going to Korea. What happened with that? Was he not a Ben in that particular timeline? I was thinking they were going to be duplicate characters of each other, but that absolutely went nowhere. But my biggest issue that I had with Ben is him being from another timeline, him being from the Sparrow Academy family, and watching the Umbrella Academy family treating him like he's their Ben. I get it. It's almost like another Marvel comparison, like Deadpool and Wolverine. This is the Wolverine that we're just meeting for this film, but he's taking borrowed emotions and they're treating him like they already know him, but they didn't know him. This is the a-hole Ben. This is the Ben who didn't like them, and I just was so frustrated watching them making all these decisions to try to save someone who didn't care for them. And even when Ben tried to care, it was too little too late. So again, the Ben being from another timeline, being from the Sparrow Academy, was just so frustrating to watch, and easily the worst version of the character that we've seen in this entire series. Now, sticking on Ben, the show gave us what happened with Jennifer, which I was glad to get that finally revealed, and seeing their bond taking place in the right timeline. I am to assume that the show is saying that in the right timeline, they belong together. Ben saved Jennifer and she always knew that. So I would assume that that was like a fixture point in the timeline, that they would always have to be together. That's the only thing I can come up with of why they had this strong bond, because honestly, when it came to Ben and Jennifer's relationship, it just felt so rushed. Like, they just fell in love so quickly and it felt forced just for the sake of the plot. Lastly, speaking about Victor, who I thought probably was the best character of this final season, and was the best character in season 3 as well. And I think Elliot Page is one of the best, if not the best, strongest performer of the show, and was easily the strongest performance of the season. But I did not like the handling of him confronting Reggie. Again, it fell flat to me because it's very similar to what they did with Ben. That isn't the Reggie that he grew up with all those times throughout the main timeline. That was a different Reggie. This Reggie doesn't hold the same mistakes as that Reggie. So again, it was so frustrating. They were putting all this development and all this anger and frustration from Victor into Reggie because, again, this wasn't his Reggie. It was so frustrating to watch as well. I'm going to end by saying this. I think the 6-episode format was the worst decision for this season. I'm not sure if that was a Netflix budgetary decision or if the creators chose to do this, but nevertheless, the decision just ruined this entire final season for me. The reason I say that is because, as I've mentioned in my character breakdowns, the character stories were not only rushed, but they were also forced just to service this fast speeding plot that was faster than a train that was going through the time. But the impact was never there, because we had zero time to actually sit in scenes, to let scenes breathe and having moments feel impactful, and the show was just always moving at a fast pace. I felt that the tone, which by the way, the tone has always been silly and goofy and chaotic, which was the charm of the show to me, but that particular charm was non-existent in this final season for me personally. Now, to wrap things up, I will remember this show for being extremely entertaining and fun, and had such incredible heart within those first 2 seasons, and I always just was able to relate to these characters. Even though I didn't grow up with so many siblings, I just like how the show showed this dysfunctional nature of this family, and despite all their drama and dysfunctionalness and things going on, they always fought for one another through thick and thin, even with the world coming to an end, and that's something that will always stick with me about this show. Those are my main pros and cons that I had about the finale, the season overall, and as a fan, I have to admit that I thought that this was a disaster of a season in my eyes. I truly don't take any joy on shitting on this season, but again, you need to understand how much I love those first 2 seasons, and even like some elements of season 3 and spots of this final season, but at the end of the day, it just is how I felt that this season was just an absolute mess. But agree or disagree with my opinions, I want to hear yours in the comments below, from what worked and didn't work in this finale and this season overall. How would you all rank all 4 seasons? And lastly, what will you remember most about this entire series of the Umbrella Academy? That's going to be the end of this video. I thank you for making it to this point. If you all can do me a favor, hit the thumbs up, share your thoughts and opinions in the comments below, and also consider sharing this video. But also consider sticking around by subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. That way you don't miss out on any of my future content. You all are awesome. Stay safe, and I'll catch you all on the next breakdown.